Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into the fascinating world of linguistics. We'll be looking at excerpts from the 2024 Linguistics Monograph, When Arguments Merge, to get a better understanding of how linguists analyze sentence structure, especially when it comes to verbs.
We're going to be focusing on verbs and their arguments.
Oh.
You know, like who did what to whom.
Okay.
By the end of this deep dive, you'll start to see how some grammatical rules that seem totally unrelated are actually connected in some pretty surprising ways.
Okay, let's unpack this.
All right.
The monograph dives right into something called merge.
Right.
I'll be honest, when I first saw that word, I thought we were about to talk about corporate mergers.
Sure.
But it turns out this is way more interesting.
It really is. Merge in linguistics is basically the fundamental operation for how sentences are built. Think of it like this. Words have these hidden features or tags, almost like a dating app, that determine which words they can and can't combine with in a sentence.
A dating app for words? I
Yeah.
love that. So is that to say that words have preferences for other words, just like people do?
Exactly. Each word has a sort of profile with preferences about who it wants to hang out with in a sentence.
Okay.
These preferences, or features as linguists call them, have to match up for words to make sense together. For example, a verb might have a feature that says, I need an object. That's why he ate sounds incomplete. The verb ate needs its perfect match, something that was eaten.
So he ate cake, then, would be a perfect match in the world of verbs and their arguments. This is already making so much more sense than my high school grammar classes.
I hear that a lot. The way linguists break down sentences can be very illuminating.
Yeah.
For example, the book talks about something called weak economy, which is this idea that language, just like people, prefers efficiency.
Okay.
In other words, languages have a way of getting things done using the simplest means possible.
So it's like taking a shortcut to get to the meaning of a sentence as quickly as possible.
Exactly. And the order in which we understand the different parts of a sentence is influenced by this idea of efficiency.
Okay.
Take the sentence, the book was given to John, for example.
Okay.
The order in which we understand the giving and receiving of the book is determined by this principle of weak economy.
That is so cool. But I have to admit, just hearing you explain it makes it seem so obvious. Like, of course, language is going to find the most efficient way to communicate an idea, but it's not something that we consciously think about.
You've hit on a really important point, which is that most of us aren't walking around thinking about these grammatical rules, but they're operating beneath the surface of our awareness whenever we speak or write. We'll be coming back to this idea of efficiency as we start to look at even more complex grammatical structures.
I'm ready. Hit me with your best grammatical mystery.
Okay, how about this? Passive sentences. These are constructions where the doer of an action seems to disappear.
Okay.
For example, the cake was eaten.
Ooh, good one. This is like a magic trick where the magician makes the subject vanish into thin air, but instead of a hat and a wand, it's all happening with grammar.
It really is. But there's no real magic here.
Right.
Instead, you have to remember that the underlying structure of a sentence can change, even if the words on the surface look very similar.
And those features we talked about earlier, the ones that determine which words can go together, they're playing a role here too, right?
Yes. The features are still there, even when we make a sentence passive.
Okay.
Let's stick with our cake example. In the sentence, the cake was eaten, the verb eaten still expects an eater.
So the eater is still lurking out there somewhere, even if we don't explicitly say who it was. I'm starting to realize that a lot of this comes down to understanding these hidden features that tell words how to behave in a sentence.
That's a great observation. Once you start to see the features, you can't unsee them.
Right.
Like you've unlocked the secret code to understanding how language works.
And our source material says there's more to this passive voice mystery. Apparently there are these things called symmetric and asymmetric passives. Fill me in. What are those all about?
It turns out that languages can be very picky about which argument of the verb can become the subject of a passive sentence. Some languages, like English, seem to have more freedom, allowing both the giver and the receiver to be the subject in a passive construction. This is what linguists call a symmetric passive.
Okay.
For example, we can say, the book was given to John, but we could also say John was given the book.
Right.
Both work grammatically.
So English is being symmetrical in how it forms its passives. What about these so-called asymmetric passives? What makes them so different?
Great question. Asymmetric passives are much stricter about who gets to be the star of the sentence.
Okay.
They only allow one of the arguments, either the giver or the receiver, to be the subject.
Okay.
Let's take another example from our monograph. Conjobal, a Mayan language, shows a classic case of an asymmetric passive. In Conjobal, if you have a sentence like, she saw you, the verb agrees with both the subject and the object. It's like the verb is shaking hands with both of them. But when you ask who saw you, things get interesting.
Got.
The word order changes, and the verb takes on a special form that linguists call agent focus.
Agent focus. It sounds like we're shining a spotlight on the one who did the seeing.
Exactly. This agent focus form only shows up when we're asking about the subject of the sentence. It's like the verb is saying, hey, the usual subject is missing. Pay attention to whoever fills this role.
So in Conjobal, the object, you, can become the subject of a passive sentence, but the original subject can't always make the switch. It's like a one-way street for becoming the grammatical star.
That's a great way to put it. Now, you might think English is more flexible because we can say both the book was given to John and John was given the book, right?
Yeah, it seems like English is all about equality for givers and receivers.
On the surface, it does seem that way.
Okay.
But there's a catch. Remember those hidden teachers we talked about?
Yeah.
Well, English has a few tricks up its sleeve, too.
Oh, I knew there had to be more to this story. Spill the tea. What's English hiding?
Let's look at how English handles something called binding.
Okay.
Imagine the sentence. John showed Mary to herself in the mirror. The word herself has to refer back to Mary, the one being shown.
Right. Makes sense. You can't show John to himself if he's the one doing the showing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But now, if we change the sentence to John showed herself to Mary in the mirror, it sounds completely wrong.
You're right. That sounds totally off.
The reason it sounds wrong is that herself is now trying to refer back to John. And that violates the rules of binding in English.
So even though English might seem flexible at first, there are still these underlying rules that govern which parts of the sentence can refer to each other. It's like a grammatical puzzle where only certain pieces can fit together.
Precisely. And this tells us that even in English, there's a preferred order for how those arguments are merged together.
It's like English is playing coy, making us think it's more flexible than it really is.
And just when you think you've cracked the code, the plot thickens. Remember those pesky we questions we talked about earlier?
The who, what, where, when words. How could I forget? They always pop up when you least expect them.
Right.
What happens when they enter the picture?
Well, it turns out that those who words have a special power.
Okay.
They can actually change the grammatical rules of the game.
Hold on. Are you saying that just by asking who or what, we're completely rewriting the rules of grammar?
In a way, yes. Linguists have discovered something called the double object movement asymmetry, or DOMA for short.
Okay.
It's a mouthful. But it basically means that when you have a passive sentence with two objects, like the book was given to John, and you ask a question like, who was the book given to? You can no longer have John as the subject of the sentence.
Wait, so you're saying who is the book given to is wrong?
It sounds a little off, doesn't it?
Yeah.
To make it grammatically correct, you'd have to restructure the sentence, perhaps saying something like, to whom was the book given?
That does sound better. So it's like, who has bumped John out of the grammatical spotlight?
Exactly. The who has priority and forces the other parts of the sentence to rearrange themselves. It's like they're playing a game of musical chairs, and who always gets a seat. Our source material says, this happens because who words have an extra feature that triggers movement to the front of the sentence.
So they're like those VIP guests who get to skip the line and everyone else has to adjust. It's amazing how these tiny words can have such a big impact on grammar.
It is fascinating, isn't it? And this movement can even affect other phrases in the sentence, like those prepositions to and by that we talked about earlier.
Got it.
You see,
Yeah.
these prepositions act like signposts, marking the location of the arguments in a sentence.
Okay.
But their position can be influenced by the why word and those underlying features we've been talking about.
Okay.
For example, in passive sentences, the by phrase, which introduces the agent, typically appears after the verb.
Like in, the cake was eaten by my brother, right?
Exactly. But in active sentences, it's more common for the to phrase, indicating the recipient, to come after the verb, as in, I gave the book to John.
So their positions are basically switching places depending on whether the sentence is active or passive. It's like a grammatical dance where everyone has to know their steps.
Precisely. And the choreography of this dance is determined by those hidden features and merge operations we've been discussing.
Right.
It's all connected.
My mind is blown. This is way more interesting than I ever thought grammar could be.
I'm glad you're enjoying the deep dive. Now, remember how we were talking about how English allows both the giver and receiver to be the subject in a passive sentence? Well, our source material says that not all languages play by the same rules.
Oh, really? Tell me more.
It turns out that some languages are sticklers for the double object movement asymmetry, while others are more flexible.
So it's like some languages are more grammatically strict, while others are more go with the flow.
Exactly.
Yeah.
For example, Norwegian is very strict about which argument can be the subject of a passive sentence when you ask a who question.
Okay.
It's like they have a very clear seating chart that can't be rearranged, even for VIPs.
So in Norwegian, if you want to ask who about the recipient, they're automatically promoted to the subject position. There's no other option.
You got it. But languages like English are a bit more lenient, allowing for some wiggle room in how they structure these types of sentences.
Okay.
It's like they have a more flexible seating chart that can accommodate different arrangements depending on who's at the grammatical party.
This is making me realize how diverse languages can be, even when they're trying to express the same basic idea.
Absolutely. Each language has its own unique way of putting the pieces of the puzzle together. And some languages don't even allow you to form passive sentences with two objects at all.
Really? No passive sentences with two objects? How does that even work?
It might seem counterintuitive, but remember those features we talked about? Well, in these languages, the indirect objects, the ones typically introduced by two, might not have the right features to become the subject of a passive sentence.
So they're stuck in the grammatical passenger seat and can't move over even if there's an open spot.
That's a great way to visualize it. Their lack of the necessary features restricts their movement options. They simply can't occupy the subject position in a passive construction.
Wow, language is full of surprises, and just when you think you've seen it all, you learn about a whole new set of rules. I'm starting to understand why linguists get so excited about this stuff.
Right.
But all of this talk about features and who movement is making me wonder, are there any languages where the who in a question actually agrees with the verb, even if it's not the grammatical subject?
That's a fantastic question, and it brings us to a really important point about cross-linguistic variation. We've been talking a lot about English and a few other languages, but there are thousands of languages spoken around the world, and they don't all follow the same grammatical playbook.
So what you're saying is that there are even more linguistic mysteries out there waiting to be solved.
Exactly. And some of these mysteries involve languages that do things a little differently.
Okay.
Take Chamorro, for example.
Chamorro, that rings a bell. Remind me where that one is spoken.
Chamorro is spoken in the Mariana Islands in the Pacific Ocean.
Okay.
And in Chamorro, we see something really interesting called way agreement.
Okay.
It's like, who is a celebrity guest, and the verb rolls out the red carpet.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. So who gets the VIP treatment in Chamorro? What does that look like?
In Chamorro, the who word in a question can actually cause the verb to change its form, kind of like that agent focus we saw in Q and J.
Okay.
It's as if the verb is bowing down to the woo word, even when it's not the subject of the sentence.
So even though who might not be the grammatical subject, it still has enough power to influence the verb.
Exactly. It's a reminder that we need to broaden our perspective when we're looking at language.
Yeah.
What might seem strange or unusual from an English-centric point of view could be perfectly normal in another language.
This is blowing my mind. I'm starting to realize that grammar isn't just about memorizing a bunch of rules, it's about understanding the logic of how languages are structured.
Right.
And that logic can be really different depending on which language you're talking about.
That's a great insight. And it's one of the things that makes linguistics so fascinating.
Yeah.
Each language offers a unique window into the human mind and how we make sense of the world around us.
I have to admit, I'm a little sad that our deep dive is coming to an end.
Yeah.
But before we wrap things up, I'm wondering if you can connect all the dots for us. What's the big picture here?
You mean besides the fact that grammar is secretly way more interesting than most people realize?
Yes. Aside from that incredibly important point.
Well, I think the main takeaway here is that these grammatical structures we've been talking about, they aren't random. They reflect a deeper logic that governs how we communicate meaning.
Right.
Those features we keep coming back to, they aren't just random tags. They represent essential properties of words and phrases.
Right.
And those properties determine how words can be combined and interpreted.
It's like each word has its own personality and preferences. And the grammar of a language is what allows those personalities to interact in a meaningful way.
I like that analogy. It's not just about stringing words together, it's about fitting them together in a way that makes sense, based on the rules of that particular language.
We started this deep dive by talking about how sentences are built, and now I'm seeing how all these seemingly small grammatical details, word order, passive sentences, even the way we ask questions are all connected.
Exactly. And these connections reveal a deeper logic, a system of rules that governs how we construct sentences and communicate meaning.
Right.
It's like a code that our brains have cracked. And this code allows us to understand each other, even when we're talking about complex or abstract ideas.
So next time I hear someone say that grammar doesn't matter, I'll have to set them straight.
I'll be right there with you. Grammar is the backbone of language, and it's what makes communication possible.
I have to say, this has been an eye-opening deep dive. We've learned so much about how linguists analyze language, and we've seen how even the smallest grammatical details can reveal something fascinating about the way we think and communicate.
It really is fascinating.
You've given us so much to think about. To our listener, keep those linguistic detective hats on and never underestimate the power of grammar. Until next time, happy deep diving.